Benjamin Lulich, how are you? It's so good to see you.
I'm doing well.
Welcome.
You.
Yeah, welcome. That's so nice. I'm so excited to talk to you today and welcome you to the next episode of the series here. And we've got one more next week. And I gosh, I guess I would just like to, introduce you as principal clarinet at the Seattle Symphony, which is awesome and I've known you for a long time, but I want you to tell us, our audience, a little bit more about you and sort of your history and you, growing up playing the clarinet and how you got into the clarinet. That would be awesome for us.
Oh yeah. Well, I kind of got introduced to classical music through my brother, who was learning the violin, and he would bring home these cassette tapes of violin concertos. A movement of Beethoven, a movement of Bach, Brahms. And we would just kind of sit there listening to this music, and that was kind of what first introduced me to what classical music was. And eventually I wanted to play an instrument myself, and I wanted to play something different than my brother. And you know the strings all kind of looked the same to me, so I went over to the wind instrument side of things and kind of narrowed things down until I got between clarinet and saxophone, and somehow I picked the clarinet, and I think it was a good choice.
Yeah, we're very fortunate that you did. Absolutely.
And I started taking some lessons and really enjoyed it and just kept with it. I don't know how much more detail you want me to go into.
Also, when you studied, I believe, with Lloyd DeLuca as a youth, right?
Yeah.
And I know that I met you during those days, and then you went on to Interlochen, and then after Interlochen, tell us a little bit about that period of time.
Yeah. So after Interlochen, I went to Cleveland Institute of Music and studied with Frank Cohen.
Hmm.
Um, that was a really great experience learning from him and hearing Cleveland Orchestra every week.
Absolutely, yeah.
Uh,
Amazing musician, that guy.
yeah. And then I went to Yale after that and studied with Schifrin
Mhm.
for a year, and then I got a 1 year position in Kansas City Symphony after
Mhm.
that, and so I took a year off from Yale. And then at the end of that year, I got my first permanent job, which was principal clarinet of Pacific Symphony.
Mhm.
So I ended up not going back to Yale and finishing my degree, but just starting my first tenure track position.
Yeah, sure, sure. Yeah. So when you were growing up with your brother playing the violin, I remember very specifically that you guys used to do a lot of duets and play together a lot when you were kids, right?
Yeah,
You kind
that's
of had a gig scene going when you were really little, right?
yeah. I mean, we played at a couple cousins' weddings,
Right.
duets, and we just used to grab music, whatever it was, Bach double violin concerto or anything really, and we would just start playing, and that's kind of how I learned C transposition.
Right.
Was because I was just constantly transposing all of these violin parts, and I think that was a really good skill to learn very young, because now it's like reading C is no problem for me.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely something that I noticed when you came to Interlock, and that was something that was very unusual about you in the sense that you just had that experience, right? And I mean that's something that I think, especially in today's world, that a lot of the younger students are looking for those kinds of opportunities. So, I mean, any advice for them would be great from you, just as far as what to look for and the things to consider when you're working with other instrumentalists in that way.
Yeah, I think if you're young, I mean, just getting practice sight reading and getting practice transposing stuff. Sometimes I used to go through some of the Rose etudes and you know play it up a step or
Hmm.
um, play it up a third, transpose it to A clarinet. Um, and I think just the more experience you can get with picking any music. I used to play through violin stuff, or
Hmm.
you know, pick a line on a piano part, and just kind of play through it on clarinet. And I think getting that kind of practice sight reading, whether you're transposing or not, is great practice. Yeah, I think sight reading new music and then transposing music you already know,
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think is
Something you're familiar with, right? So when you're in your current position and you're learning about new repertoire that the orchestra is coming through all the time, what's sort of your process in that? Like how people don't really talk about this, and this was something I really wanted to get you to talk about because I think it's something that's important that we learn early on,
Mhm.
and sort of your process as to when you're in the job and you've got a lot of repertoire that you haven't done, or you're trying to balance at least a lot of repertoire you have done, and new things that come through that are very difficult in today's modern music. That what the process is for you, and the timing, and how you gauge your practice in order to get things ready for concerts.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think now is very different than when I was first starting out in my, first playing full time orchestra, because I've gone through a lot more of the repertoire now,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
so there are fewer surprises, I guess,
Hmm. Hmm.
at least with older music. It's always a surprise with with some of the new stuff.
Right.
Um, but I've played all the Beethoven symphonies now, all the Brahms symphonies, and so my process there, I think, is a little different
Hmm.
when I was first starting out, because when you're first starting out, you're just learning all this repertoire and
Yeah.
the first time, or maybe just for the second time. And but for me, we're lucky in Seattle. We have a great music library. I'm up there all the time asking, what's coming up. Um, is there, what's do you have the new piece yet? Can I take a look at it?
Right.
Um, and they're always great about giving me, letting me take a look at whatever's in. And I mean, I try to stay at least a month ahead of everything. And especially for new pieces or for really difficult pieces, even further ahead than that, because what I like to do is kind of get the music and start taking a look at it, see what are the problem areas, what's going to be difficult. Um,
Yeah,
and
let's actually talk about that little point right there because I think that's interesting.
Mhm.
I mean, that's I think something that we all do, right? We see a piece of music and then we identify almost immediately the places that we know are going to be tricky and or technically and or musically, and I mean those are the things. So, is there a process in that you think about when you're going through new music?
Um,
Like, do you mark the part? Do you do anything specific that reminds you of that spot? Or
I don't, not really. I just kind of try to remember it. I think I try to be, real focused on what I'm doing. Actually, I think I have right before everything came to a halt, we were working on
mm,
this
hmm,
ready.
hmm,
And I mean, you open up to any page, it's just
right?
these notes, you know, for 20, 29 pages of just technique.
Yeah, it's like that chamber symphony, right? Everyone goes, "Oh no," it's like,
And anytime you have a John Adams concert coming up,
right?
a lot of woodshedding. Uh,
Yeah.
but it's just kind of, it's to me, it's a matter of getting there a little on the early side
Hmm.
and start working on it. And what I usually do is I work pretty hard about a month out, and then it kind of tapers off as I get, um, into all the other concerts we're doing, and then about a week or two ahead of time, then I'm back to the grindstone with. So I kind of do a lot of work early and then kind of let it sit and then come back to it,
Hmm.
um, and I find that is sometimes very helpful.
So is that the same process that you had early on, or is that something that you sort of grown to know more about yourself in the way that you learn things?
Uh, yeah, I think I've grown to know more about how I work.
Uh-huh. do you have sort of a sense in your brain that says, oh yeah, it's going to be great. Like that part, I know, I can do that. And then there's other parts where I really need to do this every day for a month, or, like I think everybody has that, but I'm just curious of how you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the time for me, there's a concept in my mind that if I put in the work, it's going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes I'll find a difficult passage and I'll start working on it and I'll say, oh, okay, well this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then I remember a few years I was performing the Nielson Concerto, and I had worked on it, with you at Interlochen and with Frank Cohen at Cleveland, but I had never actually performed the piece,
Mm-hmm.
and that was one piece that it took a lot of time, and it was
Mm-hmm.
every day
Mm-hmm.
for a month and a half, just doing the work, and
Mm-hmm.
getting it. And I mean, there's a few hairy passages in that, and
No doubt, no doubt. And I think I even maybe
we
have talked about this on some other series. Maybe it was with Boris. I can't remember, but just talking about, it's one of those pieces that maybe it was Anthony. Just doesn't come back. Like you learn it, and then you feel like you're ready, and you play a concert, and it goes well, and then a couple years later, you come back to it, and it's like completely unfamiliar. It's one of those pieces.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and there's certain passages in there that just never feel comfortable, and
Hmm. Hmm.
and for me it took like a month and a half of just really intense focused practice on some of those passages to get them to feel halfway comfortable. Um, so I think I'm able to kind of assess for myself pretty quickly like what's going to take a lot of work and what's going to take a little bit of
Hmm.
work, and
Hmm.
kind of depending on what the repertoire is,
Hmm.
kind of assess for myself what's it going to take.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I completely think that all artists have a sense after they get experience of doing these things, that a sense of what their body tells them, like, okay, yeah, I've got 3 weeks. All right, I think I can manage it in a week and a half, you know. And some people have to do it for, 2 months because their mind tells them that if they don't do it that way, then when they get to the concert, they're just not going to be confident in it, right? So everybody has a very different perspective on that, and I think it's really important to talk about it because it's something that is discovered, over time, and it you can give students and or colleagues ideas about how to approach things like that, but it really is like a matter of figuring it out yourself, and how your body feels, and that kind of woodshedding. You said woodshedding, and that's always something that is also very sort of a personal preference in how you do that. So I'm curious, when you've got these sections, where you're working on some crazy part of the atoms, are you how do you approach it? Like the first time you look at it, what's your process?
um, for me, kind of the first thing is just kind of going through it, just kind of playing through it. It doesn't have to be up to tempo or anything. Something like that, it's really hard to take up to tempo the first time, you know,
Sure.
but just kind of getting into it, figuring out a little bit, what the piece sounds like. Um, Oftentimes you'll start to see patterns, um, and just kind of getting into that mindset a little bit. What's this
Mhm.
piece about? What's the technique here? What's it going to take to get this worked up in time for that first rehearsal? Um, I remember, there's some pieces we've done pieces by Marc-Andre Dalbavi
Mhm.
that were really difficult, or we recorded a bunch of Henri Dutilleux music.
Oh, right. That was a few years ago. That's right.
Yeah, some of that stuff is just like every time you come back to it, it's like a new
He
piece.
has that one huge cadenza in that was it one of the symphonies, right? One of the Ditti's symphonies that's like this huge cadenza. I remember you talking
Uh,
about that. Do you remember that?
I don't.
No. Okay. That's okay.
We did a bunch of his music in
Right.
years, and it all kind of runs together.
Yeah, it's okay.
It's really cool stuff, but some of that
Hmm.
stuff was just, it took a lot of just kind of repetition of practicing it,
Uh-huh.
to get it in the mind, to get it in the fingers. Um,
What do you do every day to maintain that?
that's a good question. I think it's a lot easier when we're in the symphony season,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
we're doing like 2, 3 programs a week,
Right.
oftentimes, and so there's always a constant, barrage of music that we're going
Hmm.
through, and so
So
I
you're sort of feeling like you're in shape all the time, right?
yeah.
So if there are moments that during those weeks where you're just doing so many concerts and you feel really in shape, are there things that come up to you that you think, oh, I got to really work on this sort of aspect of the clarinet and put it on a list and things that you come to later and things like that. Do you think about that as well?
um yeah, I mean, it certainly feels much easier to me
Hmm.
when I'm in shape and doing it all the time.
Hmm.
It's and but I think on the other side of that, it's, you can get burnt out a little bit. You know,
Hmm. Hmm.
there's so many concerts, so much repertoire, and we've got a few weeks off in the summer every year,
Hmm.
and it's always actually really refreshing to come back in the fall. And even though we haven't been doing it for a few weeks, somehow that time off and that just kind of refreshing restart can sometimes make things a little easier also. So I don't know, it's a tough question for me to answer, because I think in some ways, always being in shape makes things much easier, but
Hmm.
also a little time off is really valuable too.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think that sometimes, I remember a few years ago, just having this conversation with students and coming across a student who had never taken time off like ever. And I and and I remember that I have this conversation with you. Maybe.
I don't know, but it sounds like me.
Maybe. Um, but it was definitely, and I was sort of surprised just because, like as I said before, I think it's a love-hate relationship, and there's certainly times where I think giving it its own space away from you is really important to do, and because it is an intensive art, and it's an immense amount of awareness as you're playing and doing all the things that one does when you play any instrument or sing, and I think certainly taking time off is like you're right, it refreshes and it you get excited about it when you come back to it, and it feels better in a way. Like, I mean, sometimes you can work so hard on something and then all of a sudden, you know put it away for a little while and come back to it, and it's all of a sudden it just works. It's like video games. You sit there and you do this video game for like hours, and then you're getting past this one moment finally, but it takes hours, and then 3 days later you lay off of it and you come back to it, and it's boom, you do it the first time. Why is that? Why does that happen like that? And it's something to do with just the intensity of our brains. And I mean,
Yeah.
to me, I think that's part of it, is just being able to relax, and let go of some of that. So that's really interesting. So what's on your stand now? I know everyone's in a different mode at the moment, and what things are you working on?
Well, actually, yeah, up on this stand here is actually just some more music that I wrote. I've been kind of posting these videos of some clarinet chamber music that I've written. I wrote the music a long time ago, and it's
That's
just
awesome.
something I got out and just started recording some of these pieces.
That is great. I mean, yeah. I mean, yeah. Make sure everybody knows about it. That's really awesome. Yeah. What kind of music do you listen to?
Well, right now I'm stuck at home with my wife and my 3-year old, so we're listening to a lot of Disney songs.
Okay.
Uh,
Hey, it's not so bad. It's not so bad. They're very catchy.
they're very catchy tunes. Yeah. I listen to a lot of classical music, and some kind of rock and pop stuff occasionally too.
Yeah. And I know you've always had an interest in jazz too, so you probably,
A little bit, yeah.
yeah.
Not too much jazz lately,
Uh-huh.
but in the past I've liked some, especially like Dixieland or
Yeah.
style. A lot
Pete
of
Fountain was my inspiration as a kid, actually.
what's that?
Pete Fountain was my inspiration to start the clarinet
Yep.
when I grew up in Houston. Yeah.
My grandfather used to listen to Artie Shaw and Benny Goodman and all those swing era big bands.
That's amazing. Ben, do you get nervous?
Not very often. I usually only get nervous if I know I'm not prepared,
Uh-huh.
and that's not very often for me. So
Uh-huh.
I
Uh-huh.
think I learned early on, for me personally, that if I had the confidence there that I was prepared and could do it, that I didn't get nervous. And when I was very young, I think there were a few times where I wasn't as prepared and noticed that I was more nervous. And so, yeah, for the most part, if I'm prepared, uh, very, very little amount of nerves.
Mhm. Do you get sort of the butterflies before you walk on stage?
Sometimes,
Uh-huh.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
kind of a, excitement, adrenaline rush,
Right. Right.
and maybe just a little bit of nervousness in there, but
Uh-huh. It's a
um,
good nervous.
yeah.
Hmm. Right. In your sort of years of playing through orchestra repertoire and of course a lot of chamber music and solo works too. And I've asked this of all the guests just because it's interesting to hear new things that people discover about themselves. Is there anything about your technique now that you've discovered that you do maybe from differently from other people, and is it something that you feel like you could describe or talk about in a way that might give ideas to younger players?
Um, I think maybe there's only one thing that I kind of notice about what I do that's maybe a little different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's kind of I don't let's see if I can describe it. Because I don't double tongue,
Mm-hmm.
but I can occasionally throw in a double tongue syllable.
Mm-hmm.
And usually I find it's easiest when there's a resistance change, like crossing the break.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so something like just a scale. When you cross the break, then I can throw in a like a k syllable.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And then so for fast passages, I'll try to use that um, to help my tongue get through, a lot of articulation, and then I'll start notes with the air as well. So it kind of helps out the tongue a little bit, so you don't have to do so many articulations in a row.
Yeah, I've seen this before. This is interesting. I had a student just a few years ago that really successful at combining single tongue and double tongue and being able to just do it constantly. And it was kind of remarkable. I mean, it takes an amazing amount of coordination to do that, but yeah, I think it's really, especially, for anyone who's got particular issues with speed and just trying to get lighter, it might be that's a great thing to consider is combining them.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. Anything else in the technique that you do, like any shading or anything like that with fingers for pitch and things like that?
Um, I I do a lot less shading now than I think I used to.
Uh-huh.
Just the way I have my instrument set up now, and
Hmm.
I'm so used to the instrument now.
Yeah.
Um, that I don't do as much shading as I used to. But maybe a technique thing for trills on the pinky
Mm-hmm.
trills. I remember when I was playing in Pacific Symphony, and second clarinet at that time was James Zimmerman, and he noticed that I was kind of leveraging my elbow when I was trilling with my
Mm-hmm.
I I never actually noticed that myself until he mentioned it.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I do just kind of like
Mm-hmm.
try to bring the elbow out, and somehow it changes, the way that I don't
The
know
muscles, yeah, right. The sort of the
muscles and
muscles of it.
ligaments or
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I have now consciously done that occasionally, especially like D to E flat trills, if you want
Uh-huh.
to try to get that quick.
That's actually interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think I do that. I think the other thing is locking the pinkies. So as you're lifting it, you sort of lock it, and then you can get a
Yeah.
much
Hmm.
faster trill out of it. Yeah, because if
Yeah.
you're just doing it from the knuckle, it's pretty it becomes kind of that it's like just too slow, right? I mean, sometimes you want to go really fast. So yeah,
Right.
no, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a interesting technique that yeah, nobody talks about that.
Right.
That's good. That's really good. Um, is there anything else? I mean, do you play? I can't remember. Forgive me. Do you play any bass or E flat?
I do. I used to play a lot of bass in E flat. I don't play as much
That's
anymore.
uh-huh.
But yeah,
Did you gravitate to one more than the other?
um, I played both of them quite a bit
Mm-hmm.
in college, and I would say after college I gravitated toward E flat.
Mm-hmm.
The year I was in Kansas City, I was the E flat clarinetist there, and then I subbed a lot in Cleveland and LA playing E flat.
Uh-huh.
So I liked the E flat more than the bass, but I have played a lot of bass in the past also.
I find most clarinet players either, I mean, a lot of people do them both really, really well. I mean, kind of amazing. And I definitely find that students, are gravitating toward one or the other just because it's physically, whether or not it's the hand size or the size of the instrument and that sort of thing, but also just voicing of it. Sometimes it just sort of takes off for one more than the other.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think as players tend to get more experience, they start doing more of both. And for me, that was definitely the case. Like I just wouldn't touch the bass clarinet
Mm.
like for the longest time. And E flat was always sort of the more natural one for me. And as I got older and started getting into playing more of the auxiliary instruments and bass and horn and things like that, I started loving them. Like it just
Yeah.
became uh, well, love is a strong word. No, no, just kidding.
No, it can be a ton of fun, and I
No,
mean,
I totally agree. I totally,
if you're looking for job opportunities,
absolutely,
whether long
absolutely.
term or freelancing, I mean, knowing bass and E flat is a great skill to have. And I even played some of the contrabass clarinets, which are kind of fun if you're blowing the low notes, but not so much fun if you have to try to play technique on them.
No, I mean when I hear someone who plays those instruments really well, I'm just in awe because it's just like, wow, like
Yeah,
the amount of air pressure and the amount of sort of control that some people have on those instruments is just incredible. Like it's
yeah.
just yeah. So you guys have, I'm sure Seattle's now sort of toured quite a bit since you've been there and various halls and things like that. When you're in different halls and different spaces and you're trying to sort of adjust to the new space, what do you find you have to do the most, or what adjustments do you find um, that you're concentrating on the most? When you're in new spaces.
Sure. Yeah, it's each hall is obviously different, and I think a lot of it boils down to, what does it feel like when you're playing? Can you hear, yourself out in the hall, or is it, kind of very dead and feels like you have no resonance,
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think for me, my first instinct is to like try a different reed or something. Um, but I think what I've learned is that you just kind of have to adjust your mental space a little bit, um, and realize it probably sounds better out in the audience than what you're hearing on stage if it feels terrible.
Hmm.
And um, I guess another thing would be like you're playing all by yourself in an audition and you're in a big live room. Sometimes I might think to kind of um, slow things down, slow the excerpts down, so that it just become this wash. Um, and if you're in a dry space, go in the opposite way, especially on the slower excerpts.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think it kind of for me it just has to be do what I know I'm supposed to do. Play
Yeah.
the way I feel comfortable and don't worry quite as much about the sound of it.
Hmm. Hmm. I think one of our other panelists talked about this too, in the sense of there is definitely a learning curve for the give and take of what we think we hear up close and what's actually being projected. Um, I think that's a real phenomenon about the clarinet. Actually, that's something that is takes a lot of time and experience to understand. But we all sort of grow up listening to ourselves in the practice room, by ourselves for a long time, a lot of hours, and you want a certain kind of sound up close, and it may be something that you start investigating or experimenting with because you suddenly are in a very different space with a whole team of people, and you're trying to make your concept of sound fill up that space. And it definitely, I mean, yes, you're right, the first instinct is reeds, equipment, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think so much of it is thinking about and hearing the feedback. That's always something else too, right? And hearing feedback from other people, and recordings, and or just being in a space, getting into a space early enough that you can play by yourself and figure out what's going on. That's another thing that's really important. But yeah, that's what do you find the most challenging as far as your work in going between sort of solo chamber and orchestra playing in that way, meaning like setups and or the adjustments that you have to make.
Um, I don't I don't personally make a lot of setup changes.
Hmm.
Changing mouthpieces or reeds or clarinet or anything. I kind of try to stick to one thing and kind of just I think a lot of it is just listening and being aware to what's going on around you. Are
How does one actually learn how to do that? Like, that's a really good question. Like, how do you become more aware of what you're doing as you're performing?
hmm I think it partly comes with experience because when we're younger and we're less sure about technique or our own playing, we're a little bit more focused on what we are doing.
Uh-huh.
And I think as you grow to be more comfortable with your own playing and get more experience playing with other people, you kind of naturally, I think, just kind of start to see what else is going on around you and be more aware of everything. So how do we help that process along? I think score study is one thing that can be really helpful
Great.
because if you know some of the things that you need to listen for, um, that can always help you be more aware of what else is going on.
Yeah, I'm sure even when you were, taking auditions and doing all the different sort of audition circuit that, you're researching into recordings of this orchestra, recordings of this orchestra, and researching stylistic things with the different types of music. And obviously, when we play a Brahms symphony excerpt, and then all of a sudden you've got to play a Galanta or Miraculous Mandarin or something. It's not the same. So you've got to know all of that stuff. It's part of. I was sort of relate it to, you know, even before my day when they, believe it or not, when typewriters were still around, and all of a sudden, okay, so you're doing a typewriter. All of a sudden, we've got phones, and then all of a sudden we've got okay, fax machines. Those are gone now, basically. And then all of a sudden, these things started popping up, and you're sitting at a desk and you've got like all these devices around you, and you're trying to sort of multitask, right? And that's kind of what it's like when you're playing a musical instrument. You're multitasking constantly.
Hmm.
And if you don't feel that you are, it's probably you should worry about that, because it definitely is something that you're constantly thinking and moving the gears to figure out what's coming up next. You're always trying to pre-plan everything, right?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean that's interesting when you do a lot of solo. I mean, I heard you at the Clarinet conference. I guess it was what, 3 years? Is it a bit 3 or 4 years ago now?
4 years.
Lawrence, is it
Years.
4? Yeah, from Lawrence, Kansas, and I mean, I have to say, it's still the best Weber I have ever heard
Oh,
live.
thank
Like,
you.
just amazing, and it was really cool. And for me, sitting, I was like in the third or fourth row. I think I was just sitting there and just, wow, I was like a big grin on my face. It was an amazing performance, and so talk about that experience, and preparing for what is probably the hardest audience you'd ever played for, right? It's like studio class. You got to play for you're in studio class, and you're playing for all your colleagues,
Yeah.
and it's like that's the hardest thing to do. Like suddenly you go out in the public, it's like way easier.
Right. Yeah. I mean, playing for an entire auditorium full of pianists is pretty tough.
I know.
Um, I mean, the Weber Second Concerto is one I've played a few times, and I actually really enjoy the piece. I know a lot of people have these really bad memories of, or bad connotations of Weber clarinet music as being,
Hmm.
what every junior high student, plays
Hmm.
of this for their solo and ensemble contest. And, I always found them to be a lot of fun and actually very well written for the clarinet. And
Hmm.
so I always tried to push aside that kind of negative feeling about these Weber concertos, and look into, what is this musically, and
Hmm.
it's a fun piece, and
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
it's got kind of operatic elements. It's got obviously a lot of virtuosic technique to it. And so my approach to Weber, is just kind of finding articulations that work easily and naturally for me, so that I can really focus a bit more on the musical singing in the piece. And so having experience playing it already gave me kind of a lot of confidence going into that performance. And um, I spent time practicing it because I knew the audience
Yeah, of course.
well, and
Yeah.
just tried to go out there with confidence,
Mm.
doing it from
It's
memory.
hard. I had the same experience when I was younger. I mean, it's much easier when you're younger to do that sort of thing, because it's like, you don't even think about it, you just kind of do it, right? And I remember playing the Denisov for, I think it was the Belgium. I was in Belgium a number of years ago,
Mhm.
and I remember looking out and thinking, okay, I can do this. It was Eddie Daniels and Sabina Meyer and Carl Leister and Larry Combs were all sitting like in a row, like 5 rows back, and I'm like, oh my gosh, wow, you know. That was pretty intense. I figured though, if I could do that, I can pretty much do anything, right? Like, you know, and you played the Weber. I mean, Denisov at least is at a point where not everybody knows that piece, but the Weber, everyone knows that piece, right?
I remember you playing the Denisov for our studio class once at Interlock, and
Yeah, it was a piece. Yeah, it was probably around the same period of time even that I did that. I don't remember now. The
I,
years
I
just
think I think you said you had played it a lot and you were gonna give it a rest, but you'd play it one more time for our studio class.
I hope my students now don't get the idea. Oh, that's really funny. I think maybe we're about time to go to questions. Is there anything else you'd like to, I don't know, chat about? You sound, I mean, it's such great to see you, and thanks so much for doing this. It's especially during these crazy times. So
My pleasure.
I
Yeah,
wish you well, and please tell all my friends there in Seattle hello.
sure, will do.
Yeah, yeah. So I think Joel's going to come back and he's got some questions for us. Hello, Joel.
Hola, a wonderful conversation. So, talking about past stories, Ben, I remember years ago when I first met you and started hanging out, became friends with you. You told me a story that I think everybody here would really enjoy. The first time that you played with the Cleveland Symphony when you were studying with Frank. Um, can you tell that story to everybody? Because I think they would really enjoy it. I remember if it was Firebird, correct?
Oh, okay. Firebird. Well, that was actually, it was not the first time that I played with the orchestra, but that was one of the times that I played with it. Maybe that was the right about the time I graduated from Cleveland, and I got a call one evening saying that Dan Gilbert, who was the second clarinetist back then, that he had to go in for like an emergency tooth procedure the next morning, and they had a like a Friday morning matinee concert of the complete Firebird ballet with Boulez conducting, and so I showed up the next morning and sat down in the second clarinet seat and got there plenty early so I could look at the music. And I had, Frank Cohen over here and Dan McElway over here, and we were just kind of going back and forth, like, okay, play this, because I had never played the whole ballet. I just knew the suite. So I'd go over some stuff with Frank, and then I'd go over some stuff with Dan McElway, and we're doing that so I could kind of learn the part real quick. And half an hour later, we were performing Firebird Ballet with Pierre Boulez conducting. So it was a pretty cool experience.
Yeah, God, that's a pretty cool experience. Pretty nerve-wracking experience.
Yeah,
Yeah,
really. I
that's
mean,
amazing.
Boulez, he was
Of
very
course.
clear, and it was actually a lot of fun. Yeah.
Actually, this is a good time or a good sort of audience to talk about this. One time when I was playing with Cleveland, also the we were and Boulez was conducting. There was a break or something, and he was standing around talking to a bunch of people, and I took in the score to the Debussy Rhapsody, and I I showed him this one little moment in the very first page where a lot of times people will take a breath just before dee dum, dee right, and or it could go dee dee dum, and I talked to him about that. Just sort of, I just wanted to get into my mind how I think or how he thought that it should go, and because I've heard it both ways like forever, right? And he looked at the score and he goes, "Oh, absolutely no breath." He's like, all Debussy, never take a breath like that. Like, never break the phrase, never break the slur, right? Yeah, it was a very interesting. I mean, I'll never forget that, of course. But Belez, I mean, somebody definitely knows what he's talking about.
All right. So the next question is from Kristen Pieri. How did you get involved with the Hollywood Studio Orchestra for Ben? And what advice would you have for aspiring studio musicians?
Uh, okay. Well, I'd say the best advice, or maybe not best advice. I don't know. One very important piece of advice is to make sure you know how to play all the clarinets. When I was playing some of the movie stuff, we would get a call or an email the night before telling us which clarinets to bring.
Mm.
I remember one time getting a phone call and it's okay for tomorrow. You need to bring a B flat clarinet, a bass clarinet, and a basset horn.
Ay, ay, ay.
But other times it would be, E flat clarinet and clarinet. Other times it would be B flat clarinet, A clarinet, bass clarinet, contralto clarinet, contrabass clarinet. So
it's like those little foam pills you drop in water, and then all of a sudden you've got a basset clarinet or basset horn, right?
yeah.
Amazing.
So you have to have access to those instruments and know how to play them. That's a really important part of it. But how I got into it is kind of almost by accident, happenstance almost. When I got my job in Pacific Symphony, the guy who had just retired, who was there before me, was Jim Cantor, who's also a mouthpiece maker and did a lot of studio stuff. And so there was kind of a little bit of an opening, I guess. There was room for some more clarinetists, and so kind of stepping into his old job was kind of a start already. And then we ended up premiering a piece by James Newton Howard, who's a big film composer, and Jim used to play for his movies. And there was, at the beginning of this piece, there was this really high altissimo clarinet part, really soft, kind of with like bowed crotales and stuff. And I guess I played it okay because he started calling me to come play on his movies. And then from that, I just got other work too. So it's a little bit who you know, I guess. It's a hard line of work to get into.
Did you enjoy it, playing in the studios? Because I mean, it's a grind, right? You can be on the road, especially in LA, for 6 hours just to get to a 2-hour call.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly liked a lot of it. Sometimes you show up and you're just playing some whole notes and it's not very interesting, but for me, I kind of liked the process too. I always enjoyed how all the pieces that go into making movies, and so being a part of that. I mean, if you can view it from that context, it's really interesting and can be a lot of fun. And sometimes you get to work on these great scores, where there's a lot of good music, but each film is a little different. The directors are different, the producers are different, what style of music you're doing is different. I remember showing up for one movie called Rio. It's an animated movie, and it's very Brazilian. And I got called in at the last minute because somebody got sick or something, and there's just like just like going to town on this kind of jazzy Brazilian music, and having to sight read this stuff that's in like the key of F sharp minor and stuff. Sometimes the music was really difficult and challenging.
You have to have good sight reading skills.
But I have good sight reading skills, yeah, because you show up in the morning and there's the music on the stand, and it's like, okay, let's start recording. So yeah, know your sight reading, know your other auxiliary clarinets, and I guess the other thing is just being ready when you get that phone call, and making sure that your first impression and every other impression after that is a good one. Always being prepared.
All right. So Mary Backun asks, what specific technique exercises do you use to prepare for the repertoire like John Adams? And she also wants to know if you've ever played Nixon in China.
Hi, Mary. I've only played the Chairman dances, not the rest of Nixon in China. How do I? A certain technique of etude exercises that I prepare to practice something like this. This stuff is kind of like an etude itself. So kind of um, just getting into practice and making sure that I start early enough that I can do it over and over again, to get it into my finger, into my ear. Um, but in terms of, I also try to keep a little personal library of just small little excerpts of pieces that are really difficult, difficult passages. Um,
I
but
don't know if you know this, but Chris Sarek actually did that as well. I have I don't know, 20 pages of little excerpts of all of the. He split them up even into right hand, left hand exercises. I don't know if you have that. I may have given it to you at some point, but
I don't know.
yeah, he would go through and just sort of the more obscure things. He would put them all, right hand stuff, left hand stuff, just to work on passages. It's really interesting. I'll have to send it to you.
Yeah. But I mean, in terms of other kind of etudes or exercises, I guess I don't really have anything um, standard that I use. Sometimes I'll go over etudes I'm familiar with just to keep the technique up. Whether it's Rose or Jean or Cavallini. Just because I think for me, it's just kind of getting the fingers in shape, and then kind of getting into the piece, like the John Adams or the Nielson or
Hmm.
whatever it is.
Cool.
For Richard, um, knowing that Ben left home at a young age to come study with you in the middle of high school, what did you see in him when you first had him audition for Interlochen? And Ben, after Richard answers, what was it like leaving home so young? Most people leave home when they're 18, 19 to go to college. You left literally in the middle of high school. So what was that like for you, Richard?
I think you played for me at University of Washington, as a matter of fact, where you're teaching now. When you were maybe 14, and I still have the postcard you sent me uh, after that week. I was up there doing some stuff with Lori, I guess, and maybe Chris too. I can't remember. And I did a class there, and Lori introduced us, and I guess maybe it was the next year you came to Interlaken, so it was like it was that right after that, maybe.
I think it was two
Was it
years
two?
because
2 years, okay.
that right after that we took a family trip, um,
Mm,
and we made a stop in Interlaken so I could take a couple lessons with you. And
okay.
the following year that I came, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing the years. Uh, I don't remember a lot of things like that because it's been so long. But I guess I would say there was definitely an inherent, a natural ability there that I thought, and not only clarinet playing, but sort of and you can tell, everyone can tell, this sort of sensibility of Ben. And in fact, I don't want to embarrass you, Ben, but we always called Ben Gentle Ben because he's just such a cool-headed, super, like, you know, solid person. And that was definitely something that was, really evident in him as a young player. So I think there were, someone who's in high school. There's always, you know, um, things that you're looking for, that um, little glimpses of things that you can tell, and whether or not because I don't remember. Again, it's been so long ago, but it probably was, certain technical passages and things that you could already do when you're younger. And I remember there was a lot of life in your playing. I remember there was a lot of sort of excitement, and the other thing that I do very much remember, actually, was the amount of air production that you had when you were younger. That was something that I thought was very unusual, and thanks to Lori for making that work for you, because that was something that really helped you a lot. And and certainly wasn't something we had to work on that much. Yeah.
Um, yeah, to circle back to one other story from many, many, many years ago, when I first moved up to the Seattle area, my very first clarinet teacher, Ted Burton, kind of sent out a post on some clarinet chat board or something, and asking, anyone know of some good teachers in the Seattle area for my student who's moving up there. And Richard, you were one of the responses to,
Really? Oh, wow.
to say, hey, Laurie DeLuca's great.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
that was one of the ways that I ended up studying with Laurie was
Wow.
through you. But going to Interlochen, I went as a sophomore, and I went for 3 years. And to me, I loved it because it was, so much of this immersion into the arts world and the music world, um, and getting to play so much music and to learn with, I had a great teacher, and great students also, to play with. I mean, the clarinet studio when I first got there was impressive to say the least, and just getting that experience of all those
Hmm.
young people, doing the same thing that I was doing. Um, and I think also, having some of that competition to drive myself. Um, I was like fourth chair in band, when I got to Interlochen, and I wanted to be playing the first clarinet parts in orchestra, and so it took a lot of work to get there. But for me, I loved it, and it was it wasn't like really scary or anything to be away from home. It was just kind of it was fun, and it was a great environment. They took real good care of us, and yeah, it was a great experience.
What was it like leaving Seattle, having studied with Laurie, having your career or going through school, having your career, musical chairs, and you end up back in Seattle, and now the student has become the master, and taking over as principal clarinet. What was that like, and working with her on a daily basis?
Um, yeah, I mean it's been a great journey for me. I guess when I left Seattle, I was just going wherever I was going. You just kind of you just go. Where there's an opportunity that opens up. You go. And so I had never really thought about going back to Seattle, until the job posting came out for principal clarinet in Seattle, and I thought, oh gosh, that might be that might be kind of fun. And so I worked really hard for it, and was lucky to end up here. And um,
Do you remember how many hours a day you practiced for that?
um, 3 to 4.
You're breaking up. You're breaking up. You're breaking up.
I remember very clearly. It was probably like 3 or 4 hours in addition to the other playing that I was doing, and I would
Yeah.
kind of like wake up in the morning and brew a pot of coffee, and I would drink my coffee and practice for 3 or 4 hours until I got hungry, and then I'd go have lunch and take a break, and then go to work in the evening and play at the symphony. So it was a lot of work, and I tried to just make it really systematic work so that I didn't leave anything to chance. And one of my kind of mantras that I had going at that time was, I wanted every excerpt to be my best excerpt. Because I felt like, in the past, I had good excerpts, and I had excerpts I didn't want them to ask. And I wanted to just have every excerpt be my best excerpt so that anything that came up, I could do it and know it would sound good.
Yeah, that's actually something else I remember about Ben also, just going back to the previous comment about sort of how you were as a youth, and just you definitely had a laser focus. And that's something that is really, it takes practice for a lot of people to do that. And and experience, and that's something that you had, just even playing with your brother when you were doing that, as a kid. Like I feel like that gave you a lot of that focus. Ben, it's just amazing to have you here, and thank you so much. I know we're out of time today, but it really is a pleasure, and I wish everyone well in Seattle, and look forward to seeing you in person one of these days.
Yeah. Well, it's my pleasure
Yeah.
to be here. I'm glad I could sit here and talk with you guys.
Yes. Thank you,
Thank you.
Joel.
Thank you,
Thanks so
Richard. Thank
much,
you, Ben, as
everyone.
always. All right. Keep well.
Thank you so much.